Howdy. This video will focus on finding the domain and range of graphs. So pretty much we have a simple graph here. It's just, this would be f of x equals x, okay? Or y equals x. So now, so if y equals x, we have our standard 1/1 slope. So this is our slope here. Now, pretty much, let's find our domain of this graph. So our domain deals with the x-axis. So let's find the endpoints, the smallest endpoint of this graph. And there's an arrow. So that means it goes on forever. So that means it's what? Infinity. So we're going to put a negative infinity right there. And I'll be doing interval notation first and then set notation. So since that's negative infinity, we can't equal infinity, so we're going to use parentheses because that's excluded. So excluded is parentheses. So now negative infinity to comma, and then the other endpoint of our graph is infinity as well because of the arrow. So then positive infinity is our endpoint. So the domain of y equals x is negative infinity to infinity. Now in set notation, that would be our little bracket, our x, since our domain deals with x, our such that line, and remember how I said negative infinity to infinity means x within all real numbers. Done. So now let's do our range, and our range deals with the y-axis. So now let's go ahead and find our lowest point on our graph, which is again this arrow, which means negative infinity for our range as well, the lowest point. And again, because the arrow on our greatest point on our line is infinity as well, so infinity parentheses. Now the range in set notation would be our bracket, and instead of an x we'd use a y since we're dealing with the y-axis, such that y is within all real numbers. And that's just our first concept right there. So let's move on. Graph with a set interval. So let's deal with this graph here. We're going to have, well, first let's find our domain of this graph. And our graph has two closed dots. Alright, so if they're closed dot, that's going to be included. And we're going to use brackets for that. And for set notation, we'll be using less than or equals to. So our domain of this, let's find the lowest point on our graph, or the leftmost point on our line, and that would so that would be this right here. So let's make a line up to the x-axis, and that's going to touch -4. So that includes -4. So we're going to use a bracket, -4, comma. Now let's find the rightmost points, and that would be this point here, which is a closed dot, so it's included. And let's go ahead and make a line to our x-axis. That would be 3. So then -4, comma 3. And since it's included, we're going to use a bracket. So bracket. This is the domain in interval notation. Now the domain in set notation, remember just do your bracket. Since we're dealing with domain x, such that, then we have our endpoints of our interval, so just put our endpoint, -4. Since we have a bracket, we're going to be using less than or equals to our variable x, another bracket, less than or equals to, and our other endpoint, 3. There you have it. So now let's find our range. So R for range. Our range will be, let's find the lowest point on our interval, which would be this dot right there again, and then make a line to our y-axis. And that would be a -4 as well. So, and since it's a closed dot, we're going to use a bracket because it's included, so -4, comma, and then find the uppermost point of our line, which is this dot again. It's included, and we're going to go ahead and make a line to our y-axis, and it's a 3. So then we're going to put a 3 here, so comma 3, and since it's included, we're going to use a bracket. There's our interval notation. So now let's do our set notation. Set notation, remember, just do a bracket. And since we're dealing with range, we're going to use y instead of x. So y such that our endpoint, since we have a bracket, we're going to use less than or equals to. Our variable bracket is less than or equals to 3. And there is our range and set notation. Let's move on to our next example. So now we have this graph, and this dot here is supposed to be open, so let me color that in black. And so now let's find our domain of this graph. Domain. Let's find the leftmost point on this graph, and that would be this point right there. And make a line up to our x-axis, and that would be -2. So put a -2 comma. Now since this is an open circle, this is excluded. Excluded deals with parentheses and a less than sign. So let's go ahead and put a parentheses right here in front of the -2, since it's a open circle. So parentheses -2 comma, and then let's find the rightmost point of our graph. And dang it, that's supposed to be an open circle too. Alright, so open circle, rightmost point on our graph is right there. So then go up to our x-axis, and that would be touching the positive 4. So let's put a 4 right there. And since it's an open circle, we're going to be using parentheses since it's excluded. So parentheses right there. So now let's put this in set notation since we just used interval notation. So domain would be bracket. Domain deals with x. So x such that endpoint -2. We have a parentheses, so we'll be using a less than sign. Our variable less than again 4. And there you have it. Now let's go with our range. So range, we have let's find our bottommost point of our line, which would be this line right there, point right there. So let's go ahead and make a line to our y-axis, and that touches -4. So we're going to have parentheses, since it's an open circle, -4, comma. Now, let's find our uppermost point of our line, which would be right here, and make a line to our y-axis. And that would touch our -1. And then since it's open circle, parentheses. So there's our interval notation. Let's go with our set notation of range. Set notation, we're going to use our bracket. And since range deals with the y-axis, we'll put y as our variable, such that our endpoint, -4, parentheses deals with less than our variable y, less than again, -1. There you have it. Alright, domain and range of this graph. Moving on, and now let's go with our domain for this graph. So D, what's our leftmost point? Our leftmost point is right here, and that actually touches our point -1, -2, -3, -4. So -4. Since that's an open circle, we're dealing with parentheses. So parentheses -4, comma, and then our rightmost point right here. Make a line to our x-axis that deals with 2. So 2, close circle, bracket. Domain and set notation. That was interval notation. Now we're doing set notation. Bracket x such that -4 less than x less than or equal to 2. Bracket. Let's deal with our range. Range. Our lowestmost point is right about here. And since I'm not dealing with specifics, let's go ahead and say that's -2. So that line touches negative 2, so we're going to use a bracket, negative 2, comma, now our uppermost point, which is right there. So I can say that's 1.5, right? So let's go 1.5. So, and then since that line touches 1.5, let's use a bracket. Now that was our interval notation. Let's do our set notation. So we're going to have a bracket. Y deals with the range, so Y such that negative 2, bracket will be less than or equals to, Y bracket is less than or equals to 1.5, close bracket. Alright, there's our range, the domain and range of this graph. Last example, we're going to have this graph right here. Alright, so let's go with our domain. So D, and now let's find our leftmost point, which is this point right there. So going down to our x-axis, that is negative 2. And since it's a closed circle, we're going to have bracket, negative 2 comma, and then our rightmost point, we have an arrow. So this arrow means goes on forever, so our rightmost point would be positive infinity. And we can't equal infinity, so we're going to have parentheses. So a domain in set notation, we have a bracket here. I'm sorry, not a bracket, the other kind of bracket. And domain deals with x, so x such that now we have x can be in between negative 2 and infinity. So pretty much x is just greater than negative 2. So we're going to have x is greater than or equal to negative 2. Close bracket. And that's our domain in set notation. Now let's go for a range. So R, where is our lowest most point of range? So lowest most point is this arrow. So that would mean negative infinity. So we're going to have negative infinity and a parenthesis since we can't equal infinity, comma. Our uppermost point is right here, which is 2. So 2, closed circle means bracket. Now we're going to have, this is our interval notation. So range in set notation, we're going to have our bracket, y for range, such that we have negative, y can be from negative infinity to 2. So then that means pretty much y is less than 2, or less than or equal to because of the bracket. So y is less than or equal to positive 2. Alright, so there is our domain and range of our last example. Hope you enjoyed the video, tried using cool colors, etc. See y'all in class. Thanks for watching.